大家平安，大家午安，大家好。今仔真难得，咱有邀请到一个美国人为台湾专心咧发声音啦吼。伊捌讲过一句话，讲用美国人的身份，用赎罪的心情来为台湾人咧发声。是安怎会美国人会用赎罪的心情呢？等者咱认真甲听看卖啊！吼，毕竟一定是有原因、有事故，才会用即个情形来咧为台湾要发声音啦吼。首先，我呢拜托谢警官先生来甲伊即个Michael Richardson做较详细介绍一下咧吼。
非常感谢蔡会长吼提供这个机会，互我会当邀请咱一个好朋友，伊对这个 Boston 专工来吼。伫伊要下讲以前，我简单甲大家介绍一下。伊实际上过去伊所做的吼，是拢是伫这个当然是写文章啦吼，专业性是政治方面的研究吼。过去写过真侪文章，甚至是音乐方面伊嘛去报道吼。但是伊伫2004年到2008年的美国的大选，伊并无想讲倒一党，但是替全国的些计票吼，同迄个选票的迄个分派吼。伊则因为因个关系，伊是讲只要选美国总统是美国人才能选总统，若美国属地人是要安怎来选总统？安尼伊才开始去研究，研究时才去碰到即个咱最近去进行的即个林志升即个事件的即个过诉的代志。伊去碰到了。找真侪资料，找去台湾去，伊就去甲即个何瑞元联络，跟住何瑞元呢就甲伊送真侪资料互伊去参考，伊才知影讲原来有即项代志，伊其实真正摸着台湾的代志是伫今年的正月才去摸着，拄伫咱已经决定讲要林志升即个诉讼案件，伫要去上诉庭的时阵，2月7号上诉庭以前，伊伫正月底才去接触着，接触着了开始写文章。伊讲伊逐日学，逐日写。那么伊是本身是即个 Boston 的观察部的即个自由的即个专栏的记者吼。那么伊写文章出嚟，伊毋是讲干那。是写到迄个奥巴马总统，伊是实际上是发布伫即个报社顶端，所以读嘅读者是非常的多吼。佮即摆网络遮方便，其实是全世界有关心台湾人，大家拢去甲看，大家讲起来看卖。伊是对正月30到今仔日差不多4个月内底，到今仔日写66篇有关台湾的报告，其中。因为真侪台湾人提供真好的资料互伊，包括苏联的400年史，伊嘛读，甚至最近伊报告讲，即个517大游伊嘛读，伊不但读个写，还佫报告涨价这个事情，所以任何甲台湾有关的事件，伊拢不但去读过写，那么伊接受了，伊感觉讲做一个美国人呢，伊非常的见效，是安怎讲见效？伊讲第二次世界大战发生的时阵，伊还未出世，所以伊对台湾的造成今仔日命运啊，伊感觉伊无法度去帮忙。但是伊做一个美国人，今仔日存在美国人，伊感觉迄是伊的责任，伊要替人发声。等下伫个演讲内底吼，我想真精彩。咱即摆大家拢知影讲，你有真侪时间。你嘛有真侪工具会当去找资料，但是伊实际上是甲70年内底，对1940年开始到今仔日2009年，即中美国甲台湾所发生的代志，尤其是美国总统，伊伫当初时安怎判断讲甲台湾的关系，安怎做成决定，我是拄好9月时阵有甲咱的主办单位做一个要求啦吼。因为咱今仔日遮在座的大家就大家向前伫遮，当然是假使若伊若讲一句翻一句是真好，确实较好了解。毋过咱今仔有真侪即个媒体伫遮吼，假使讲咱若互伊的部分全部互伊讲了，伊会用真简单、真白话化的即个英语来甲伊讲， 了的时阵，咱来 Q&A 的时阵，咱才有来翻译，可能安尼较规矩。你讲的时阵较规矩。啊，昨昏伊伫即个旧金山遐做一场演讲，伫遐大家听啊非常的感动。像阮遐迄个台湾会馆一寡朋友吼，迄个丁信荣医师啦，啊，甲即个陈德辉，即摆新的理事长陈德辉先生，伊讲这听10遍嘛爱听啦，所以伊才昨昏阮伫遐无现场的录影，感觉真歹势，真见识吼。啊，所以今仔特别伫遮拜托咱若有录影的朋友录过来了，咱会当互全世界的台湾人去听讲台湾今仔是啊变做政治地界。咱是啊，生存伫个地方，这甲美国过去每12年的总统是啥物关系？搁落来台湾人要安怎行？哦，这有一个真深的伊甲你解说。啊，咱听伊讲了，咱来 Q&A 时，咱才请廖先生来甲咱做一个翻译甲啥呢？我是安尼甲大家建议就好吼，哦，会使啦吼。好，啊，无咱即摆请伊开始，然后谢谢。
Thank you for a warm welcome. I have to speak in English because it's the only language I know. I come today, unfortunately, on such a nice day, to talk about, for what me is a very sad topic, the shameful history of the United States government with respect to the people of Taiwan. Before World War II, the United States paid little attention to Formosa. It was outside our area of interest. From 1895 up until the war, it was Japanese colony. The United States didn't really care about Formosa so long as there were not pirates operating off the shore or lighthouses were erected to protect the ships in navigation. Beyond that, we didn't care about Formosa. Formosa first came to the attention of the United States at the same time that the United States was attacked at Pearl Harbor. While the planes that attacked at Pearl Harbor came from aircraft carriers, the planes that attacked the Philippines came from airfields on Formosa. 1942 was largely spent by the United States preparing for war. The country was still reacting to attack and hadn't really spent time concentrating on which islands would be liberated first. It wasn't until about 1943 when the war planners at the War Department began to seriously give attention to Formosa. There was a debate between the War Department over which islands to attack first. The Navy wanted to begin the attack on Formosa, and there was a bombing campaign on the island by the United States against the Japanese. But the Army, they wanted to attack the Philippines and Okinawa before an attack on Japan. Douglas MacArthur, who had been driven out to the Philippines and said, "I will return," wanted to return. So the debate between the Navy and the Army went on through 1943 into 1944. President Franklin Roosevelt had to make a trip to Hawaii to meet with the Navy and the Army to decide, should Formosa be attacked or should it be left alone and begin an attack on Okinawa and the Philippines, or even a direct attack on Japan. That was all that the Army cared about Formosa up to that point, and that was the first Taiwan question. Shall we attack the island? About the same time, the island came under discussion to Franklin Roosevelt's attention by Chiang Kai-shek. Franklin Roosevelt was a stamp collector. He collected postage stamps. So he had some knowledge of the history and the geography of the island from his postage stamp collection. But he had very little information from official government intelligence. George Kerr, in his book Formosa Betrayed, talks about how little the American government knew about Formosa. Mostly it was old newspapers accounts and navigational maps, and very little else about the island and the people on the island. In December of 1943, Franklin Roosevelt went to Egypt and met with Winston Churchill of England to plan the war. They decided they were going to have Chiang Kai-shek come to their meeting to discuss the war in China, which was going on between the Chinese and the Japanese. Of course, the Civil War is already underway as well, with the Mao and the communists, and Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists, and determining how much fighting would be done by the Chinese was in the mind of Roosevelt and Churchill, but they had other business to discuss. It was their intention to put Chiang Kai-shek at the end of the discussion, talk about China last. But Chiang Kai-shek came to the meeting in Cairo with Madam Chiang Kai-shek, and it became the first thing that was talked about. Madam Chiang took over the meeting. The interpreters were silenced. She became the interpreter. She led the negotiations. And Roosevelt was unprepared to deal with Madam Chiang. As a result, the Chinese business was discussed first instead of last, and Roosevelt made two promises to Chiang Kai-shek. One, that the United States would begin an attack in Burma to take pressure off the Chinese army. The other promise that he made was that any property seized from China by Japan would be returned. And Madam Chiang was quick to point out that included Formosa. Well, Roosevelt should have known better from his stamp collection days that Japan did not seize Formosa from the Republic of China. Japan got Formosa back in 1895 by treaty from Imperial China. The Republic of China didn't even exist then. But that fact was not discussed there in the desert of Egypt. At the end of the conference, a news release was issued, a one-page piece of paper, and it mentioned that China would get Formosa. It was not a treaty. It was not approved by Congress. It was not even signed by anyone. A news release in the middle of the war, in the middle of the desert. Chiang Kai-shek knew what he was doing, called it the Cairo Declaration. He also knew that Roosevelt was a stamp collector. And he made up a postage stamp, a Republic of China postage stamp, with Chiang's picture and Churchill's picture and Roosevelt's picture to memorialize the treaty that was not a treaty. Churchill was furious at Roosevelt for agreeing to start an invasion of Burma because it would pull the troops away from where Churchill wanted them. So Churchill, within a week, talked Roosevelt of going back on his promise about the invasion of Burma. Churchill didn't care about Formosa. It was not discussed. And the matter was mostly dropped. At that time, Roosevelt was a sick man. His heart condition that would kill him a year and a half later was already bothering his health. And he had mental fog. He had trouble speaking his words at times. This wasn't commonly known to the public, but it did not put him in a good position to negotiate or discuss the affairs of Taiwan with Chiang Kai-shek. But that's what happened. The conference ended. Roosevelt goes back to the United States. The war goes on. But there was still this debate between the Army and the Navy should we attack Formosa? Roosevelt was at the 1944 Democratic Convention, where he was nominated for a 4th term in office. He left that convention early to go to Hawaii to meet with the Army and the Navy and make a decision on the invasion of Formosa. Left the convention early. At that time, Roosevelt's vice president was named Henry Wallace. Henry Wallace would later run for president in 1948 himself. Henry Wallace was basically a socialist. And Roosevelt had decided he no longer wanted Henry Wallace as his vice president. So at the convention in 1944, July 1944, just before Roosevelt went to Hawaii to decide about the invasion of Formosa, he named Harry Truman to be his vice president. Harry Truman was probably the least prepared president that this country has ever had. He never went to college. He was a failed businessman. He was a small-town politician from Kansas City, Missouri, that came out of a corrupt political machine. His worldview was very narrow and didn't extend outside Missouri. While Harry Truman was vice president, he did not even know the United States was developing an atomic bomb. It wasn't until Harry Truman became president that he was told, oh, by the way, Mr. President, we've got this bomb we've been making. Harry Truman probably couldn't have found Formosa on a map. Nobody was telling him anything, including Roosevelt. Harry Truman complained later in life that Roosevelt really only spoke to him 3 times after he was named as vice president. And they were short conversations. Back to the convention. Roosevelt, after naming Harry Truman as his vice president, goes to Hawaii, listens to Admiral Nimitz of the Navy, listens to General MacArthur, and decides we'll attack Okinawa, we'll attack the Philippines, and we will not attack Formosa. Then Roosevelt returned, died within a year. Harry Truman is now put in office, knowing absolutely nothing about Formosa. Harry Truman is confronted with the decision of the atomic bomb. Everybody says, well, Harry Truman decided to drop the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He didn't really make that decision. He decided when to drop it, but the decision to go ahead and use these weapons had already been made by the military planners. And Harry Truman didn't want to go against the planners. There's a war being going on. He wasn't prepared to fight. He did what he was told. And the decision was made to drop the bomb, and the war ended. There was much planning at that point done very quickly on what to do about the surrendering Japanese. The Japanese were on islands all throughout the Pacific. They were scattered all through China, Manchuria, Burma, everywhere. And it was a major task to try to get American troops in place to accept the surrender. Chiang Kai-shek said, well, I'll help, and wanted very much to accept the surrender of the Japanese in Hong Kong. But the British would have no part of that. They said, we will accept the surrender. The Russians were advancing. The Russians were still moving in, gaining ground. We were very much concerned that the Russians were going to take the entire Korean peninsula. A decision had to be made quickly on who was going to take the surrendering prisoners where. So late one night, August 10th, 1945, a tired and overworked Army colonel by the name of Charles Bonesteel was told, prepare an order for General MacArthur on the surrendering Japanese armies. Figure out who's going to surrender where. Bonesteel, working in his office with poor maps, spent most of his time trying to figure out what to do about Korea. Spent very little time thinking about Formosa. On Korea, he had a map from National Geographic. That's all he had to work with. He noticed that there was the 38th parallel. He thought, well, maybe that would be a good line. And that became the dividing line between North and South Korea. A disastrous decision for the country. It harmed the economy in both North and South Korea. The 38th parallel was an imaginary line. Did not respect the mountains, did not respect the rivers, did not respect the roads, did not respect the political boundaries, and it immediately created a problem. But the Russians agreed with it, and that's all that they really cared about, is stopping the Russian advance, because they were afraid the Russians would take the whole peninsula. But Colonel Bonesteel had to prepare a plan for everywhere. So as he went down his list, he came to Formosa. He knew there was no American troops on Formosa. He knew that we were spending troops here and there, and that there was an urge to get troops back to America. So Bonesteel remembered, the Cairo Declaration. We'll have Chiang Kai-shek do it. He's fighting the communists. This will help him out. Chiang Kai-shek, well, I said, I have no way to get my troops to to Formosa. I'll need help. So the U.S. Navy, the 7th Fleet, landed Chinese troops on Formosa on October 25th, 1945. The day before, the United Nations came into being, October 24th. And China was made a member of the Security Council of the brand new United Nations. If the United Nations were to be asked about the future of Formosa at that time, and since China would have veto power. So the coincidence of the dates is unfortunately very accidentally significant to the fate of Taiwan. When the Chinese troops arrived on October 25th, they didn't even want to go ashore. They'd heard rumors about Japanese hiding in the hills waiting for them, and they refused to get out of the landing craft. The American sailors were furious at them. There were almost fights on the ships, and finally the Chinese were put ashore. The Taiwanese population witnessed this, and that immediately created an ugly climate between the Chinese troops and the people of Formosa. An ugly climate that was exaggerated by the Japanese language being spoken in the island because it had been a colony for 50 years. And the battle-hardened troops that Chiang Kai-shek had sent on American ships to Formosa viewed the Formosans as Japanese and were not kind and gentle. They processed the surrender of the Japanese soldiers. Let me check my notes and see what I've left out here. So that was October 1945. The Chinese Civil War is still going on. President Truman said to General George Marshall, see if you can't make some peace in China. See if you can't stop the fighting. And Marshall tried. And he had worked out a tentative peace between Mao and Chiang. But it fell apart. And in 1946, the fighting intensified. Chiang started losing ground to Mao's forces. And Truman made a speech about that. And I want to read a little about what Harry Truman said about the Chinese Civil War. This is Harry Truman. The Marshall Mission had been unable to produce results because the government of Chiang Kai-shek did not command the respect and support of the Chinese people. Chiang was defeated by a loss of support by his own people and by American arms, as many of his own generals took their armies, equipped with our aid, into the enemy camp. It was when that sort of surrender began to occur on a large scale, I decided to cut off further shipments to China. George Kennan, an American diplomat, told the Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, he recommended that the United States run the Chinese off the island. Acheson replied, he said, well, I don't care if there's an uprising. Maybe we should support a Taiwanese uprising. But Truman wouldn't listen. And they were not making formal recommendations. It was talk. This is the type of consideration the United States government was giving to the Formosa situation. And never once during this time was there any consideration over the self-determination of the people of Taiwan. After the Japanese surrender, many on the island were looking for the United States to offer them a chance to choose their own path in the world, to choose for themselves what future government they wanted. And instead they got an occupation army. An occupation army that was corrupt and cruel. February 28th, 1947. I don't need to tell anyone in this room the significance of that date. If I was talking somewhere else in Los Angeles to a different audience, probably no one in the room would know that date. Until January of this year, I did not know anything about 228. It was not taught to me in school. It wasn't in my textbooks, and I didn't learn about it in the news. I suppose if I'd sought it out, I would have discovered it, but it was not taught to me. When I learned about 228 in January, I was astounded. I couldn't believe it. And I began a very detailed search and study of American history from that point on to see exactly what we had done to the people of Taiwan with our ignorance and our accident and our disregard for the human rights of the people. Well, what was Harry Truman doing? George Kerr, in his book Formosa Betrayed, talks about sending daily cables telling about the bloodshed going on. Kerr said the bodies are piling up on the roadways. They're piling up on the riverbanks. They're floating in the harbors. I've seen men being led past our council office to their death. Kerr went out when he saw several young men being led with wire wrapped around their throats at a gunpoint. And he went out to see what possibly thing he could do, just shocked. And the Chinese nationalist soldier leading these young Taiwanese men to their death recognized Kerr as an American official and gave him a snap-see salute. George Kerr writes in his book that this was the ultimate act of betrayal by America. Kerr kept cabling for help, help that never came. Finally, a Republic of China airplane flew to the island from the mainland. and a lone American military officer stepped out of the plane, got into a Jeep, was driven around Taipei for a couple of hours, got back on the plane, said everything's okay. And that's what Harry Truman wanted to hear. By now, the Cold War was raging. We went straight from World War II to the Cold War. Instead of fighting the Japanese and the Germans, now we were fighting the communists, the Russians, and the threat of Red China. This is what occupied Truman's mind. Truman was preparing a plan, later called the Truman Doctrine. And what was the Truman Doctrine? I'm going to read several sections out of the Truman Doctrine. And this was Truman's declaration to the world: the United States would fight communism. The date of the Truman Doctrine was March 12th, 1947. What I'm getting ready to read to you was written and issued while the killing is still going on in Taiwan. With the 228 massacre underway, Truman says this: one of the primary objectives of the foreign policy of the United States is the creation of conditions in which we and other nations will be able to work out a way of life free of coercion. This was a fundamental issue in the war with Germany and Japan. Our victory was won over countries which sought to impose their will, their way of life upon other nations. And yet at that very moment, in Taiwan, a way of life was being imposed on the residents of the island while Truman is issuing this very statement. Truman goes on and explains the Truman Doctrine is to help free people to maintain their free institutions and their national integrity against aggressive movements that seek to impose upon them totalitarian regimes. There is no more than a frank recognition that totalitarian regimes imposed on free people by direct or indirect aggression undermine the foundations of international peace and the security of the United States. And yet, while he was saying that, that's exactly what was happening at Formosa. Truman went on and said, the peoples of a number of countries of the world have recently had totalitarian regimes forced on them against their will. That's what happened in Formosa. Truman says, when a minority forcibly is imposed on a majority, it relies upon terror and oppression, a controlled press and radio, fixed elections, and the suppression of personal freedoms. That's the martial law that was imposed on Formosa. Truman says, I believe it must be the policy of the United States to support free people who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or outside pressures. We must assist the free people to work out their destinies in this way. Well, apparently that applied to everywhere in the world but Taiwan. Truman says one thing and did another. A little later, let me back up. Not long after that, Chiang loses in China, escapes to exile in Formosa, bringing with him 1.5 million of his generals, his secret police, and the wealthy elite. Commoners, not welcome. Regular soldiers, left behind. Now suddenly there are 2 million nationalist Chinese on the island. A huge secret police network is already in place. They've got something to do. The White Terror begins. After Chiang moved into Taiwan in 1949, the United States had to kind of reevaluate their decision. And that's what led to Dean Acheson saying, well, maybe we should support an uprising. And led to the discussion about maybe we should drive the Chinese from the island. But it didn't happen. And then, in 1950, fighting breaks out in Korea. And the outbreak of the Korean War locked, from that time until this very day, Taiwan into an unsettled, unresolved ambiguity. The Taiwan question, the Taiwan problem, the strategic ambiguity. Judge Janice Rogers Brown, in April of this year, in the Roger Lynn lawsuit, called it political purgatory. Harry Truman sent a message to the United Nations through his ambassador to the United Nations in August of 1950 about Formosa. Here's what Harry Truman had to say in 1950. By this point, Truman realized that through his ignorance and inattention in 1945 and 1947, that he'd made a mistake. This is what he said in 1950. The action of the United States about moving the Chinese into Formosa was expressly stated without prejudice to the future political settlement of the status of the island. The actual status of the island is as territory taken from Japan by victory of the Allied forces in the Pacific. Like other such territories, its legal status cannot be fixed until there is international action to determine its future. The Chinese government was asked by the Allies to take surrender of the Japanese forces on the island, and that is the reason the Chinese are there now. Truman went on and said, the United States would welcome the United Nations consideration of the case of Formosa, and we would approve full United Nations investigation there. We believe that the United Nations consideration would contribute to a peaceful rather than a forceful situation to the problem. But it didn't happen. China was on the Security Council. No United Nations action. Truman realized that the only way that the matter could be resolved was by treaty, some sort of international agreement, or action of the United Nations. Since action of the United Nations was out of the question, a treaty plan was devised. The San Francisco Peace Treaty, 1952. The San Francisco Peace Treaty was written by the American government. Japan did not write the San Francisco Peace Treaty. Japan signed it. The United States wrote it. In the San Francisco Peace Treaty, Japan surrenders all claims to Taiwan. At that point, it's in the United States' hands. And our proxy government, the Republic of China in exile, on the island itself. Truman said, well, the status has got to be resolved in the future. Then he's out of office. Now we've got a new president, Dwight Eisenhower, a general. Eisenhower didn't do much about Formosa in his first year in office. He was still busy dealing with Korea. In 1954, the Chinese started shelling Quemoy and Matsu. The Republic of China government had put a lot of soldiers on these two islands. It became a center of attention. So Eisenhower developed a treaty, a defense treaty, with the Republic of China in exile. On December 1st, 1954, Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, the same man who wrote the San Francisco Peace Treaty for the American government, said this to the American people: "The treaty will recognize the common interest of the parties in the security of Taiwan and the Pescadores and of the Western Pacific Islands under the jurisdiction of the United States," Guam and so forth. That put a lid on things for a while. Hostilities increased. In 1955, Eisenhower went to Congress to talk about the defense of Formosa. Here's what Eisenhower said to Congress in January 1955. "Since the end of Japanese hostilities in 1945, Formosa and the Pescadores have been in friendly hands of our loyal ally, the Republic of China. We have recognized that it was important that these islands should remain in friendly hands. In unfriendly hands, Formosa and Pescadores would seriously dislocate the existing, if unstable, balance of moral, economic, and military forces upon which the peace of the Pacific depends. I wonder if the people on Taiwan suffering under martial law felt they were in the friendly hands of the Republic of China." Eisenhower went on and said, "In the interest of peace, the United States must remove any doubt regarding our readiness to fight, if necessary, to preserve the vital stake of the free world in a free Formosa, and engage in whatever operations may be required to carry out that purpose." Was it a free Formosa for the people of the island? No. By free Formosa, he just means it wasn't communist. He wasn't talking about freedom for the residents of the island. No respect or regard or discussion for their human rights, for their rights of self-determination. Truman, once again, "We would welcome action by the United Nations, which might bring an end to the active hostilities in the area." Well, once again, that didn't happen. The matter goes on. 1958, more shelling, more fighting, more threats against Taiwan by the Chinese. Once again, Eisenhower, this time, instead of going to Congress, calls a news conference and goes to the American public. This is what Eisenhower said in 1958. "Tonight I want to talk to you about the situation, dangerous to peace, which has developed in the Formosa Straits. In 1955, the hostilities of the Chinese communists in the Formosa area were brought before the United Nations Security Council, but the Chinese communists rejected its jurisdiction. They said they were entitled to Formosa and the offshore islands, and if they used armed forces to get them, that was just a civil war, and the United Nations had no right to concern itself." And of course, the United States didn't do anything. Khrushchev got in the picture. The Russians sent a letter to Eisenhower saying, hey, Quemoy and Matsu belong to China. Stay out of it. Eisenhower wrote a letter back to Khrushchev talking about Formosa. The territory concerned has never been under the control of Communist China. On the contrary, the Republic of China, despite the characterizations you apply to it, is recognized by a majority of the sovereign nations of the world. The government has been and is exercising jurisdiction over the territory concerned. If the Chinese communist leaders can be persuaded to place their trust in negotiation, I assure you the United States will strive towards that same end. That ended up fighting for a little while. Eisenhower's now out of office. Along comes John Kennedy. Now, John Kennedy actually talked about Taiwan back in 1950 when he was a congressman himself. And he was critical of Harry Truman. He was critical for what happened. Here's what John Kennedy said 10 years before he became president. What our young men had saved, our diplomats and president had frittered away, had wasted. He was mad at what had happened. But that was then. Now we'll move forward 10 years. It's time for the Kennedy-Nixon debates. And that, despite Eisenhower's public speech to the nation and Eisenhower's talks to Congress, most of the American public were still ignorant and unaware of Taiwan, of what was going on, of the martial law, of the lack of self-determination, of the disregard of the United States for the people of Taiwan. But it came out during the presidential debates between Nixon and Kennedy. And both Nixon and Kennedy were asked, what about Quemoy and Matsu? Here's what Kennedy said. The United States has on occasion attempted, mostly in the middle 50s, to persuade Chiang Kai-shek to pull his troops back to Formosa. I believe strongly in the defense of Formosa, but these islands are just a few miles, 5 or 6 from the Red China, within the General Harbor area, and more than 100 miles from Formosa. We've never said flatly we will defend Quemoy and Matsu if it's attacked. We will say we will defend it as a part of a general attack on Formosa, but it's extremely difficult to make that judgment. We should consult with the nationalists and attempt to work out a plan by which a line is drawn at the island of Formosa. That leaves 100 miles between the island and the coast. Nixon replied, now I think, as far as Quemoy and Matsu are concerned, that the question is not about these 2 little pieces of real estate. They are unimportant. And it isn't about the few people who live on them. They are not too important either. What? The people who live on these islands are not important? Well, I guess they wouldn't be, because the people on Formosa hadn't been important to the United States government. We hadn't respected their rights. Nixon said, it's the principle involved. These 2 little islands are in the area of freedom. The nationalists have these islands. We should not force our nationalist allies to get off them and give them to the communists. If we do that, we'll start a chain reaction, because the communists aren't after Quemoy and Matsu, they're after Formosa. I wonder if the people that were imprisoned on Green Island thought Formosa was a free island. Kennedy was only in office for 2.5 years. Didn't get deeply involved in Formosa. But what he did get involved with, and by the way, he did entertain Chiang Kai-shek into the White House. What Kennedy's involvement with Taiwan was the secret underworld. Because Chiang Kai-shek had turned the island into not just a police state, but a secret police state, it was fertile ground for the American Central Intelligence Agency. The United States, by the time Kennedy was in office, had 10,000 CIA employees at the station in Formosa. 10,000. It was the largest concentration of CIA employees in the world. All of the American spy operations for all of Asia were conducted out of Taiwan. That was Kennedy's involvement. Kennedy dies. Now Lyndon Johnson is president. I don't have much to say about Lyndon Johnson because he was caught up fighting the Vietnam War. He was still taking advantage of the secret underworld, secret police base. He didn't meddle in things. The status quo stayed the same. The Taiwan question remained a question, unanswered. Richard Nixon gets elected. What does he do? He goes to China. Well, I'm not against that. China's a big country. I mean, there's 1 billion people there. It's 1/4 of the world's population now lives in China. I'm not going to be critical of him for going to China. But he went to China at the expense of Taiwan. Nixon's trip to China led to the Shanghai Communique. Basically, the Shanghai Communique said, "One China, just not now." In the communique, a joint communique issued by the People's Republic of China and the United States, here's the Chinese side. And it's as much double talk as Harry Truman's Truman Doctrine was. Truman might have well written this. Here's what the Chinese had to say in the Shanghai Communique. Wherever there is oppression, there is resistance. Countries want independence. Nations want liberation. The people want revolution. This has become an irresistible trend of history. All nations, big or small, should be equal. Big nations should not bully the small, and strong nations should not bully the weak. China will never be a superpower. It opposes hegemony and power politics of any kind. The Chinese side stated that it firmly supports the struggles of all oppressed peoples and nations for freedom and liberation, and that the people of all countries have the right to choose their social systems according to their own wishes, and the right to safeguard the independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of their own countries, and oppose foreign aggression, interference, control, and subversion. Well, that sure didn't apply to the people of Taiwan. So what does Nixon say in the Shanghai Communique? He says, the United States supports individual freedom and social progress for all of the peoples of the world, free of outside pressure or intervention. All peoples of the world. That's what the Shanghai Memorandum Communique said. Well, is not Taiwan a part of the world? Are not the billions of people who live in Taiwan entitled to the same protection that everyone else in the world is? The United States is engaged in a double talk, double speak, double standard the whole time about Taiwan. Each president had their own way of doing it and saying it. A little more out of the Shanghai communique. This is the Chinese side again. The two sides have reviewed the long-standing serious disputes between China and the United States. The Chinese side reaffirmed its position. The Taiwan question is the crucial question obstructing normalization of relations between China and the United States. The government of the People's Republic of China is the sole legal government of China. Taiwan is a province of China, which has long been returned to the motherland. The liberation of Taiwan is China's internal affair, which no other country has the right to interfere. And all U.S. forces and military installations must be withdrawn from Taiwan. The Chinese government firmly opposes any activities which aim at the creation of one China, one Taiwan, or one China, two governments, or two Chinas, or an independent Taiwan, or even advocate that the status of Taiwan remains undetermined. They wanted a flat-out declaration, Taiwan belonged to the People's Republic of China, end of discussion. And what did Nixon say back? The United States acknowledges that all Chinese on either side of the Taiwan Strait maintain there is but one China and that Taiwan is a part of China. The United States government does not challenge that position. Well, thank you, Richard Nixon. The betrayal of Formosa goes on. Well, now Nixon's out of office. But unlike Kennedy, he didn't die. He wasn't elected out of office. He had to quit because he was corrupt, politically corrupt. The Watergate scandal drove him from office. He resigned to avoid impeachment. And Gerald Ford, who had never even been elected vice president because Vice President Spiro Agnew had to quit for corruption. Gerald Ford, a congressman from Michigan, almost as unprepared to be president as Harry Truman had been. Ford had no idea what to do about affairs of international. When he went on foreign trips, it was golfing trips, showboating. He turned to Henry Kissinger for advice. Henry Kissinger made all the foreign policy decisions while Gerald Ford was president. And Henry Kissinger was the architect of geopolitics. Human rights don't matter. Only strategic interests matter. What's important politically? What's important geographically? What's important strategically? Forget human rights. That was Henry Kissinger's view. Well, we got rid of Ford. Now it's Jimmy Carter. And this one pains me a little more than most of the rest. Out of all the presidents in my lifetime, Jimmy Carter's the only one that I personally voted for. All the others, the people I voted for, lost. Carter recognizes China. And I don't fault him for that, as I don't fault Nixon for having visited China a decade earlier. But just as Nixon sacrificed Taiwan for his trip to China, Jimmy Carter did the same thing in his recognition of the People's Republic as the China. Because the exiled government of Chiang Kai-shek, the Republic of China, was occupying the island, and they went by the name of China, and they kept talking about trying to regain the mainland, the island slid into the trap, the quicksand of history, where it's been stuck all along. So Carter issued his own communique on the recognition of China. January 1st, 1979. Jimmy Carter. The United States of America recognizes the government of the People's Republic of China as the sole legal government of China. Within this context, the people of the United States will maintain cultural, commercial, and unofficial relations with the people of Taiwan. Well, that's real nice. But he goes on to say, the government of the United States of America acknowledges the Chinese position that there is but one China, and Taiwan is a part of China. Jimmy Carter. Congress, alarmed at that, almost immediately passed the Taiwan Relations Act in 1979. And there's a line in the Taiwan Relations Act that I want to share. In the Taiwan Relations Act, it says the act is to maintain the capacity to resist any resort to force or other forms of coercion that would jeopardize the security or the social or economic system of the people of Taiwan. Well, I'm glad there's a Taiwan Relations Act, and I'm glad that says what it says. But it still does not talk about self-determination. It still leaves out that vital element that's been missing from the picture since 1945, the right of the people of Taiwan to choose their own future. Carter's out of office. Now we've got George Bush the First. And we've been bouncing back between Democrat and Republican, and it makes virtually no difference to the people of Taiwan. Each president in line has so far betrayed them on the topic of self-determination. Yes, the United States presidents have been selling weapons to the Republic of China. Taiwan's been a great source for the American military-industrial complex. The defense contractors have gotten rich selling weapons. That this unresolved political status has created an arms race. Hundreds of missiles in China facing Taiwan, and the United States military industries busy selling weapons and weapons and weapons to the island. Good for business, bad for the people of Taiwan. Bush got a number of letters. He got letters from Taiwanese American Association chapters all over the country. He got a letter from FAPA. He got letters from the mayor of Honolulu. A whole variety of letters about human rights issues. He didn't answer one of them himself. He gave them to the State Department. They gave them to a guy by the name of Dennis Brown. Dennis Brown answered all of George Bush's letters. I've got a few of them. Let's hear what Dennis Brown had to say for George Bush about Taiwan. I'm going to read that one last because that one actually wasn't by David Brown. So, the Seattle chapter of the Formosan Association for Public Affairs wrote and asked, what is to be the future of Taiwan, Mr. President? And here's what the answer was. Our consistent position, which is known to all, is that the future of Taiwan should be resolved by the Chinese people on both sides of the Taiwan Strait in a peaceful manner, free of outside interference. Well, why should the future of Taiwan be decided by the Chinese people? What about letting the people of Taiwan decide their own future? Bush was going to make one of his tourist trips to the Great Wall. So the Pittsburgh Taiwanese American Citizens League wrote him about his upcoming trip and said, Mr. President, what are you going to do about the Taiwan problem? And here's the answer to them. Under 5 successive presidents, the United States has acknowledged the Chinese position. There is but one China, and Taiwan is a part of China. During his visit to China, President Bush confirmed the consistency of U.S. policy by reaffirming the joint communiques of 72, 79, and 82, which would continue to form the basis of U.S. policy towards China. He stated clearly that U.S. policy would continue to be based on the one China principle. You will recall in the 1982 communique, the government stated has no intention of pursuing a policy of two Chinas or one China, one Taiwan. In other words, more of the same. More of the same. By the way, I got my presidents out of order. I left out Ronald Reagan. We're going to get to Ronald Reagan. I just apologize. I get my papers mixed up. But it almost doesn't matter. Because no matter which president you look up to or talk about or you read from, it's the same double talk, the same double standard, the same betrayal of the right of self-determination, Republican or Democrat alike. We'll finish up with Bush first, and then I'll get to Reagan. The Formosan Association for Human Rights in Sunset Beach, California, wrote to Bush. They were concerned about the arrest of dissidents, the jailing of critics of the Republic of China government in Taiwan. Human rights at its very core. Now we're talking about individual people, not just a whole nation. We're talking about individual people. And here's what Bush said to that. In recent years, Taiwan has made significant progress in improving its human rights policies and practices. We remain concerned, however, about lingering human rights problems, in particular about Taiwan's blacklist, which prevents certain Taiwan citizens from returning to their homeland. This practice does not meet internationally accepted standards. It is a fundamental tenet of U.S. policy that persons should not be persecuted for their political beliefs. End of the letter. Oh, it goes on with a little more double talk, but is there action? No. No action. In Canada, Taiwanese Americans in Canada even wrote to the president. The World Federation of Taiwanese Associations in Ontario, Canada wrote, this time about the jailing of an editor, Mr. Chang Ning-yong. He'd been charged with treason for publishing a draft constitution of the Republic of Taiwan. Imagine that. A newspaper editor had the nerve to publish a draft constitution for a Republic of Taiwan. And for that he was charged with treason. What did Bush say about that? Well, as you know, U.S. government policy towards China is based on the principle there is but one China. The U.S. government has made it clear it has no intention of pursuing a policy of two Chinas or one China, one Taiwan. However, the American U.S. government supports the right of free speech without regard to political content. We've made these views known to the authorities in Taiwan. A lot of help that was to the jailed editor. Well, I'm going to leave George Bush alone. George Bush the first alone. We'll go back in time now and pick up Ronald Reagan. He was a great anti-communist. Maybe he would offer a little help. And he did. More weapons. Arms sales. We'll protect the island. His arms sales policy was so aggressive that it caused alarm in China. And in September of 1981, the People's Republic of China issued a 9-point proposal. Reagan decided, well, maybe we need to kind of quiet this down a little, and issued a joint communique with Red China. The third communique, the first one we had was Nixon's. Then we had Carter's. Now we've got Reagan's. Here was the China position. the Chinese government reiterates the question of Taiwan is China's internal affair. Here's Reagan's answer. The United States government attaches great importance to its relations with China and reiterates it has no intention of infringing on Chinese sovereignty or territorial integrity or interfering in China's internal affairs or pursuing a policy of two Chinas or one China, one Taiwan. Furthermore, our arms sales to Taiwan will not exceed in quantity or quality the level of weapons that we've previously supplied. Well, that made Chiang Ching-kuo unhappy and uneasy. So Reagan had to issue another statement about our arms sales. This is his statement on the arms sales. He said the Taiwan question is a matter for the Chinese people on both sides of the Taiwan Strait to resolve. We will not interfere in this matter or prejudice the free choice or put pressure on the people of Taiwan in this matter. Well, the people of Taiwan weren't even be given a choice. It's the people of China on both sides of the strait that have the decision, he said. Or maybe he assumed that the people of Taiwan were Chinese. It's hard to tell because all of their statements are deliberately vague, deliberately worded to have confusion so that they have negotiating room. Clarity is nothing you'll find in the U.S. position except when it comes time to sell weapons. Well, Chiang Ching-kuo was still uneasy and unhappy. So what did we do? We sent 3 non-papers to the Republic of China in exile. What's a non-paper? I came across that in my whole life. I've never heard about a non-paper. And we gave Chiang 3 of them. So I did a little more research to try to figure out, well, what is a non-paper? And here's the definition of a non-paper. As used in American diplomacy, a non-paper is a document on plain paper without seal or signature, intended to convey a position or policy, but in an informal manner. We didn't even give them official document. More double talk. Double talk to them, double talk to the Chinese, double talk to the Russians, double talk to the American public, double talk to Congress. That's what's been going on out of the White House since 1945. Every president. Well, now we're done with Reagan. Now it's Bill Clinton. Oh, we had George Bush in there. I had my order reversed, so in case you keep track of history. Bill Clinton. Well, he had his own policy, the 133 policy. You know, they keep coming up with code names for all these things. So now I'm thinking, well, the 133 policy, what the heck is that? Well, the 1, that stands for one China. The 3, that's the 3 communiques with the People's Republic. Nixon, Carter, and Reagan's communiques. Clinton's going along with them. Business as usual, more of the same. But what was the last 3? Well, that was the 3 no's. The 3 no's. Is this more non-paper talk? The 3 no's, Bill Clinton's 3 no's are no independence for Taiwan. Flat out statement. The second no was no 2 Chinas. The third no, no membership in any organization that required statehood status. This even kept Taiwan out of the World Health Organization. When Clinton made one of his trips to China, the Chinese leader gave him a book the president should no business taking. It was a book that the president should have flatly refused, but instead he took the gift. The title of the book that the Chinese leader gave to Bill Clinton, The Heretic Cult of the Falun Gong. China was defending to the United States its oppression of the Falun Gong. Gave it right to the president. Almost like a slap in the face. And Clinton took it. Congress was alarmed about the 1-3-3 policy and the 3 no's. Congress tried to pass the Taiwan Security Enhancement Act. It passed in the House of Representatives. It failed in the Senate. Bill Clinton threatened to veto it if it passed in the Senate. Let me read a couple of lines out of this bill that almost became law that President Clinton opposed. In this act that Congress tried to pass, it said that Taiwan is now exhibiting a true multi-party democracy, and there were multi-parties by that point in time. Martial law had been lifted. It had an economy based on free market principles and was separate and distinct from communist China. And the act went on to say, any determination of the ultimate status of Taiwan must have the express consent of the people of Taiwan. Well, no wonder Bill Clinton wanted to veto it. For once the American Congress is talking about the will of the Taiwan people. The first time. But it was defeated. Defeated in the U.S. Senate. The act also said that it's in the national interests of the United States to eliminate ambiguity, to express its support for Taiwan's democratic government, and ensure that the Taiwanese people maintain their democracy free from coercion. Defeated. Threatened to be vetoed. Bill Clinton. Now we're up to George Bush II. Gosh, we're starting to get up to recent events. I remember him. That wasn't that long ago. People had hope when he came in. He made a statement early in his administration. A reporter asked him, well, what are you going to do about Taiwan? And he said, we'll do whatever it takes to defend Taiwan. People were encouraged. But by the end of his term, back to business as usual. Back to the same message that every other American president since Franklin Roosevelt had said. Bush had a meeting with Hu Jintao. What was the chief topic? Taiwan. But this time it wasn't the usual Taiwan question. Because there was no question. Because Bush had already got back in line. One China. No independence. So what was the one thing that Hu Jintao was upset about? It was the people of Taiwan. They're talking about independence. He asked the American president to silence the people of Taiwan. Bush just scoffed at them and said, talking now about the people in Taiwan advocating for their own independence. Bush said, don't worry about them. They are like mosquitoes who want to attack an elephant. And he promised that he would encourage and not send wrong signals and not mislead people into believing the United States supports Taiwan independence. Well, Bush, too, was good for the arms sale, good for business. You know, keep it up. Keep pumping those weapons at the island. These are some of the weapon systems that were sold to Taiwan under George Bush II. Submarine designs, Mark 48 anti-submarine torpedoes, Harpoon submarine-launched anti-ship cruise missiles, Patriot missiles, self-propelled howitzers, helicopters, F-16 fighters. They also wanted to do something else. Didn't make the news, didn't go into effect, but the military-industrial complex, the big weapons suppliers, said to the Bush administration, we've got a plan to defend Taiwan. We know you cannot sell offensive weapons that will provoke China. But we know that you can also sell defensive weapons. We've got the ultimate defense, the porcupine strategy. A porcupine, that's that animal with the pins up the back that you can't touch. The reason they called it the porcupine strategy is because they were going to mine the entire western coast of Taiwan. 180 miles of mines in the surf zone where people swim when they go to the beach. The entire western coast was to be closed to swimmers because of the bombs in the water. And the mines in the water were going to be supplemented by Harpoon missile installations along the shoreline. So when the Chinese attacked, they'd be caught in the mines in the surf, and the missiles could fire at them. The porcupine strategy. That was the military-industrial complex's proposal to Bush to solve Taiwan's problems. An outrageous idea. Well, now, at last, we've got a president who's promised change. All during the election, we heard about change. The people in Taiwan are still waiting. In fact, they're waiting to even hear something from Mr. Obama about Taiwan. I've been following it very closely, and President Obama, as far as I've been able to determine, and I look closely, has not uttered the word Taiwan once. Been totally silent. When Hillary Clinton, his Secretary of State, made her Asian tour, she bypassed Taiwan. Well, what to make of Obama's silence? Will the change that he promised come? Or will he fall in line like George Bush II and Bill Clinton and George Bush I and Ronald Reagan and Jimmy Carter and Gerald Ford and John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson and Harry Truman? I think that President Obama is going to be business as usual, and that's why he's silent. But we do have a few clues as to what the president's thoughts and intentions about Taiwan are. Unfortunately, it's not a very good message. The first clue came in the Roger Lin case. The Roger Lin lawsuit is trying to get a treaty interpretation of the San Francisco Peace Treaty. Get a judicial ruling that the promise to the people of Taiwan has not been kept, and ask for the court's intervention. In April of this year, Judge Janice Rogers Brown of the District of Columbia U.S. Court of Appeals issued a ruling. And in the very first paragraph of her ruling, she said Taiwan has suffered under political purgatory. That's hell. That's what she's talking about. Hell on earth, political purgatory. And that's what happened in Taiwan in the 228 massacre, the White Terror, the martial law. Hell on earth. The judge said she was prepared, she and the other members of the court were prepared to act expeditiously. That means quickly, to end the political purgatory of Taiwan. But she could not act because the court lacked military power. The court would only act if the president gave the go-ahead. The executive must identify the sovereign, said Judge Brown. And what did we get out of President Obama? Silence. Well, now he's not just ignoring the mosquitoes biting at an elephant. He's not ignoring citizen groups like this. He's ignoring a federal appellate judge. No answer in public, no answer in court. Obama's silence speaks louder than words. And it's not a good message. The second clue we have to Obama's thinking is with Hillary Clinton herself. Bill Clinton's wife. She's had a chance to live out one of his no's. Bill Clinton's third no was no participation in any organization that requires statehood. After the SARS epidemic, and with the swine flu epidemic threatening, the medical community said to the World Health Organization, you've got to take politics out of this. It's too important to have Taiwan in the World Health Organization. It's too important to the health of the people of the world. This should not be about politics. This should be a medical issue. When Hillary Clinton appeared before the United States Senate in January to be confirmed as Secretary of State, one of the senators asked her, what are you going to do about Taiwan's exclusion from the World Health Organization? And Hillary said, I'll see they get there. I'll work with the Taiwan government. Well, guess what? It's not the Taiwan government that's been keeping them out. It's the Chinese government. Margaret Chang, head of the World Health Organization, is Chinese. She's taking directions from Hu Jintao. That's why Taiwan isn't in the World Health Organization. But Hillary was good to her word. She did work with the Taiwan government. She got them to accept observer status, one-time observer status, as Chinese Taipei. Chinese Taipei. In April, almost the same day that Judge Janice Rogers Brown was talking about the political purgatory of Taiwan, Hillary Clinton issued a release saying, I'm happy that Taiwan is going to be at the World Health Assembly as Chinese Taipei. Well, that got around Bill Clinton's no, because they weren't there as in a statehood status, just observers as a province of China. And it stuck, not just at that conference. Just last week I was looking at a map, an epidemic map. The World Health Organization issues regular maps showing outbreak of how many diseases are in this country and how many in that country. And there's Taiwan, labeled Chinese Taipei, right there on the map. The World Health Organization map, just last week. So Hillary Clinton didn't do that on her own. She reports to President Obama. So that's another clue that Mr. Obama is not going to give us the change that he promised in the campaign. And what's the third clue? Well, it involves Korea. Korea. That place that has trapped Taiwan for 6 decades in the sands of time, unable to go forward, unable to have self-determination, trapped by the events in Korea. Well, the events in Korea now are pretty scary. They tested a nuclear bomb. They've been testing missiles, long-range missiles, short-range missiles. People are worried. They're scared in South Korea. So, President Obama appointed a man by the name of Stephen Bosworth to be his special representative to North Korea to solve this problem. I'd never heard of Stephen Bosworth before. Turns out he was Bill Clinton's ambassador to South Korea. He lives in Boston. That's where I'm from. I've been studying Taiwan lately. Now suddenly a Boston resident is the special envoy of the president to North Korea. I decided it's important to know, what does Mr. Bosworth think about Taiwan? So I looked around, and I discovered that Mr. Bosworth wrote a book 2 years ago. A book called Chasing the Sun, Rethinking East Asian Policy. Well, East Asian policy needs some rethinking, at least about Taiwan. Needs a lot of rethinking. In fact, it doesn't need rethinking, it needs thinking in the first place. Thinking that hasn't been going on. Thinking that's been ignored for 64 years. Well, here's what Mr. Bosworth, the advisor to President Obama, will be telling him. These are Bosworth's words. I'm only going to read one sentence. He's got 6 pages in here on Taiwan, but his one-sentence summary says it all. The United States should defend the status quo by continuing to emphasize to Taiwan that independence is not an acceptable goal and that any effort in that direction endangers United States interests. Well, how does independence in Taiwan endanger the United States? This is the man that's going to advise the president on what to do about North Korea? This is the man who's going to be negotiating with China because China is the only leverage we have over North Korea. Will China do that for free? Will China tell North Korea to take away their nuclear weapons and stop testing missiles for free? Or will they charge a price to Mr. Bosworth? And what price will that be? What does China want? Taiwan. And if they can't do it, the Chinese can't do it that way, they've got another route. United States politicians have been steadily dispatched. Last week, Senator John Kerry from Massachusetts was in China. Nancy Pelosi went over to China. Hillary Clinton went over there. And what are they asking for help with? The United States economy. All this bailout money, all this stimulus package, all this spending for money we don't have, that President Obama's been doing, and Bush before him. Chinese money. In the last year, China has bought $878 billion of U.S. Treasury notes. China controls the U.S. economy. What happens when they call the bill in? So between the fact that China now has got our hand in the America's pocket, and they've got North Korea threatening nuclear scares, and the man who's supposed to solve the problem says Taiwan's independence threatens the United States. And you've got the president ignoring the judge who talks about the political purgatory, change is not going to come. So what to do? The danger to Taiwan is great. I don't think from a military invasion, but from a political sellout. What to do? There's 2 things to do. There's something that the people of Taiwan need to do, and there's something that the people in America need to do. In Taiwan, the people need to make their voices heard. The march that occurred on May 17th needs to be repeated and repeated and the marches need to get bigger and louder and stronger. And not just march down any old street. Surround the U.S. Consul office. Every day, the U.S. diplomats should have to wade through crowds of protesters to get into their office. If you cannot make them see the light, we must make them feel the heat. Here in the United States, the Roger Lynn case will go forward to the Supreme Court. There may be relief, or there may not be. The case is a solid legal case, but the intrusion of politics threatens. It's a question mark. In the meantime, the public, each of us, need to contact our members of Congress and our senators and demand congressional hearings. The United States Congress has not had a hearing about Taiwan for years. It's time that Congress schedule hearings. Bring people in. Bring in groups like this. Let the voice of the people be heard. That's our challenge. Now, it's been a difficult talk to listen to. It was a difficult talk to prepare to. I didn't come with a message really of good cheer and joy. I came with a sorry history, a shameful history of misconduct by American presidents. So rather than send everybody out on this nice, beautiful day with a frown on your face, I'd like to ask everybody right now to stand up for Taiwan. Get up on your feet. Stand up for Taiwan. And let's give a couple of cheers for Taiwan. Taiwan.